Nuclear disarmament refers to both the act of reducing or eliminating nuclear weapons and to the end state of a nuclear weapon-free world, in which nuclear weapons are completely eliminated. Nuclear disarmament groups include the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Peace Action, Greenpeace, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, Mayors for Peace, Global Zero, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. There have been many large anti-nuclear demonstrations and protests. On June 12, 1982, 1 million people demonstrated in New York City's Central Park against nuclear weapons and for an end to the Cold War arms race. It was the largest anti-nuclear protest and the largest political demonstration in American history. In recent years, some U.S. elder statesmen have also advocated nuclear disarmament. Sam Nunn, William Perry, Henry Kissinger, and George Shultz have called upon governments to embrace the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, and in various op-ed columns have proposed an ambitious program of urgent steps to that end. The four have created the Nuclear Security Project to advance this agenda. Organizations such as Global Zero, an international non-partisan group of 300 world leaders dedicated to achieving nuclear disarmament, have also been established. Proponents of nuclear disarmament say that it would lessen the probability of nuclear war occurring, especially accidentally. Critics of nuclear disarmament say that it would undermine deterrence. History. In 1945 in the New Mexico desert, American scientists conducted Trinity, the first nuclear weapons test, marking the beginning of the atomic age. Even before the Trinity test, national leaders debated the impact of nuclear weapons on domestic and foreign policy. Also involved in the debate about nuclear weapons policy was the scientific community, through professional associations such as the Federation of Atomic Scientists and the Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs. On August 6, 1945, towards the end of World War II, the Little Boy device was detonated over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Exploding with a yield equivalent to 12,500 tons of TNT, the blast and thermal wave of the bomb destroyed nearly 50,000 buildings and killed approximately 75,000 people, among them 20,000 Japanese soldiers and 20,000 Koreans. Detonation of the Fat Man device exploded over the Japanese city of Nagasaki 3 days later on August 9, 1945, destroying 60% of the city and killing approximately 35,000 people, among them 23,200 to 28,200 Japanese civilian munitions workers and 150 Japanese soldiers. Subsequently, the world unregistered trademark as nuclear weapons stockpiles grew. Operation Crossroads was a series of nuclear weapon tests conducted by the United States at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean in the summer of 1946. Its purpose was to test the effect of nuclear weapons on naval ships. Pressure to cancel Operation Crossroads came from scientists and diplomats. Manhattan Project scientists argued that further nuclear testing was unnecessary and environmentally dangerous. A Los Alamos study warned the water near a recent surface explosion will be a witch's brew of radioactivity. To prepare the atoll for the nuclear tests, Bikini's native residents were evicted from their homes and resettled on smaller, uninhabited islands where they were unable to sustain themselves. Radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons testing was first drawn to public attention in 1954 when a hydrogen bomb test in the Pacific contaminated the crew of the Japanese fishing boat Lucky Dragon. One of the fishermen died in Japan 7 months later. The incident caused widespread concern around the world and provided a decisive impetus for the emergence of the anti-nuclear weapons movement in many countries. The anti-nuclear weapons movement grew rapidly because for many people the atomic bomb encapsulated the very worst direction in which society was moving. Nuclear disarmament movement. Peace movements emerged in Japan and in 1954 they converged to form a unified Japanese council against atomic and hydrogen bombs. Japanese opposition to the Pacific nuclear weapons tests was widespread, and an estimated 35 million signatures were collected on petitions calling for bans on nuclear weapons. In the United Kingdom, The first Aldermaston March organized by the Direct Action Committee and supported by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament took place at Easter 1958, when several thousand people marched for 4 days from Trafalgar Square, London, to the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment close to Aldermaston in Berkshire, England, to demonstrate their opposition to nuclear weapons. CND organized Aldermaston marches into the late 1960s when tens of thousands of people took part in the 4-day events. On November 1, 1961, at the height of the Cold War, about 50,000 women brought together by Women's Strike for Peace marched in 60 cities in the United States to demonstrate against nuclear weapons. It was the largest national women's peace protest of the 20th century. In 1958, Linus Pauling and his wife presented the United Nations with a petition signed by more than 11,000 scientists calling for an end to nuclear weapon testing. The Baby Tooth Survey, headed by Dr. Louise Race, demonstrated conclusively in 1961 that above-ground nuclear testing posed significant public health risks in the form of radioactive fallout spread primarily via milk from cows that had ingested contaminated grass. Public pressure and the research results subsequently led to a moratorium on above-ground nuclear weapons testing, followed by the Partial Test Ban Treaty, signed in 1963 by John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. On the day that the treaty went into force, the Nobel Prize Committee awarded Pauling the Nobel Peace Prize, describing him as Linus Carl Pauling, who ever since 1946 has campaigned ceaselessly, not only against nuclear weapons tests, not only against the spread of these armaments, not only against their very use, but against all warfare as a means of solving international conflicts. Pauling started the International League of Humanists in 1974. He was president of the Scientific Advisory Board of the World Union for Protection of Life and also one of the signatories of the Dubrovnik Philadelphia Statement. In the 1980s, a popular movement for nuclear disarmament again gained strength in the light of the weapons buildup and aggressive rhetoric of U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Reagan had a world free of nuclear weapons as his personal mission, and was largely scorned for this in Europe. His officials tried to stop such talks but Reagan was able to start discussions on nuclear disarmament with Soviet Union. He changed the name SALT to START. On June 3, 1981, Thomas launched the White House Peace Vigil in Washington, D.C. He was later joined on the vigil by anti-nuclear activists Concepcion Picciotto and Ellen Benjamin. On June 12, 1982, 1 million people demonstrated in New York City's Central Park against nuclear weapons and for an end to the Cold War arms race. It was the largest anti-nuclear protest and the largest political demonstration in American history. International Day of Nuclear Disarmament protests were held on June 20, 1983 at 50 sites across the United States. In 1986, hundreds of people walked from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament. There were many Nevada Desert Experience protests and peace camps at the Nevada test site during the 1980s and 1990s. On May 1, 2005, 40,000 anti-nuclear anti-war protesters marched past the United Nations in New York, 60 years after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was the largest anti-nuclear rally in the U.S. for several decades. In 2008, 2009, and 2010, there have been protests about, and campaigns against, several new nuclear reactor proposals in the United States. There is an annual protest against U.S. nuclear weapons research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California, and in the 2007 protest, 64 people were arrested. There have been a series of protests at the Nevada test site, and in the April 2007 Nevada Desert Experience protest, 39 people were cited by police. There have been anti-nuclear protests at Naval Base Kitsap for many years, and several in 2008. World Peace Council one of the earliest peace organizations to emerge after the Second World War was the World Peace Council, which was directed by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union through the Soviet Peace Committee. Its origins lay in the Communist Information Bureau's doctrine, put forward 1947, that the world was divided between peace-loving progressive forces led by the Soviet Union and warmongering capitalist countries led by the United States. In 1949, Cominform directed that peace should now become the pivot of the entire activity of the communist parties, and most Western communist parties followed this policy. Lawrence Wittner, a historian of the post-war peace movement, argues that the Soviet Union devoted great efforts to the promotion of the WPC in the early post-war years because it feared an American attack and American superiority of arms at a time when the USA possessed the atom bomb but the Soviet Union had not yet developed it. In 1950, the WPC launched its Stockholm Appeal calling for the absolute prohibition of nuclear weapons. The campaign won popular support, collecting, it is said, 560 million signatures in Europe, most from socialist countries, including 10 million in France, and 155 million signatures in the Soviet Union, the entire adult population. Several non-aligned peace groups who have distanced themselves from the WPC advised their supporters not to sign the appeal. The WPC had uneasy relations with the non-aligned peace movement and has been described as being caught in contradictions as it sought to become a broad world movement while being instrumentalized increasingly to serve foreign policy in the Soviet Union and nominally socialist countries. From the 1950s until the late 1980s it tried to use non-aligned peace organizations to spread the Soviet point of view. At first there was limited cooperation between such groups and the WPC. But Western delegates who tried to criticize the Soviet Union or the WPC's silence about Russian armaments were often shouted down at WPC conferences, and by the early 1960s they had dissociated themselves from the WPC. Arms reduction treaties. After the 1986 Reykjavik summit between U.S. President Ronald Reagan and the new Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, the United States and the Soviet Union concluded two important nuclear arms reduction treaties, the INF Treaty and START-I. After the end of the Cold War, the United States and the Russian Federation concluded the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty and the New START Treaty. In the Soviet Union, voices against Soviet nuclear weapons were few and far between since there was no widespread freedom of speech and freedom of the press as political factors. Certain citizens who had become prominent enough to safely criticize the Soviet government, such as Andrei Sakharov, did speak out against nuclear weapons, but that was to little effect. Dissident movements that emerged in the Soviet bloc in the 1980s drew attention to Soviet armaments, some demonstrating at congresses of the World Peace Council, but they were suppressed. When the extreme danger intrinsic to nuclear war and the possession of nuclear weapons became apparent to all sides during the Cold War, a series of disarmament and non-proliferation treaties were agreed upon between the United States, the Soviet Union, and several other states throughout the world. Many of these treaties involved years of negotiations, and seemed to result in important steps in arms reductions and reducing the risk of nuclear war. Key treaties: Partial Test Ban Treaty 1963, prohibited all testing of nuclear weapons except underground. Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signed 1968, came into force 1970, an international treaty to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. The treaty has three main pillars: non-proliferation, disarmament, and the right to peacefully use nuclear technology. Interim Agreement on Offensive Arms 1972, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to a freeze in the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles that they would deploy. Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty 1972, the United States and Soviet Union could deploy ABM interceptors at two sites, each with up to 100 ground-based launchers for ABM interceptor missiles. In a 1974 protocol, the US and Soviet Union agreed to only deploy an ABM system to one site. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 1979, replacing SALT-I, SALT-II limited both the Soviet Union and the United States to an equal number of ICBM launchers, SLBM launchers, and heavy bombers. Also placed limits on multiple independent re-entry vehicles. Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty 1987, created a global ban on short and long-range nuclear weapons systems, as well as an intrusive verification regime. Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty Euro signed 1991, ratified 1994, limited long-range nuclear forces in the United States and the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union to 6,000 attributed warheads on 1,600 ballistic missiles and bombers. Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty Euro signed 1993, never put into force. START II was a bilateral agreement between the US and Russia which attempted to commit each side to deploy no more than 3,000 to 3,500 warheads by December 2007 and also included a prohibition against deploying multiple independent re-entry vehicles on intercontinental ballistic missiles. Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty Euro signed 2002, into force 2003, a very loose treaty that is often criticized by arms control advocates for its ambiguity and lack of depth. Russia and the United States agreed to reduce their strategic nuclear warheads to between 1,700 and 2,200 by 2012. Was superseded by New START Treaty in 2010. Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Euro signed 1996, not yet in force. The CTBT is an international treaty that bans all nuclear explosions in all environments. While the treaty is not in force, Russia has not tested a nuclear weapon since 1990 and the United States has not since 1992. New START Treaty Euro signed 2010, into force in 2011, replaces SALT Treaty, reduces deployed nuclear warheads by about half, will remain into force until at least 2021. Only one country has been known to ever dismantle their nuclear arsenal completely. The apartheid government of South Africa apparently developed half a dozen crude fission weapons during the 1980s, but they were dismantled in the early 1990s. United Nations. In its landmark Resolution 1653 of 1961, Declaration on the Prohibition of the Use of Nuclear and Thermonuclear Weapons, the UN General Assembly stated that use of nuclear weaponry would exceed even the scope of war and cause indiscriminate suffering and destruction to mankind and civilization and, as such, is contrary to the rules of international law and to the laws of humanity. The Union Office for Disarmament Affairs is a department of the United Nations Secretariat established in January 1998 as part of the United Nations Secretary-General Kofi Annan's plan to reform the UN as presented in his report to the General Assembly in July 1997. Its goal is to promote nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation and the strengthening of the disarmament regimes in respect to other weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons. It also promotes disarmament efforts in the area of conventional weapons, especially landmines and small arms, which are often the weapons of choice in contemporary conflicts. Following the retirement of Sergio Dort in February 2012, Angela Kane was appointed as the new High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. U.S. nuclear policy. Despite a general trend toward disarmament in the early 1990s, the George W. Bush administration repeatedly pushed to fund policies that would allegedly make nuclear weapons more usable in the post-Cold War environment. To date, the U.S. Congress has refused to fund many of these policies. However, some feel that even considering such programs harms the credibility of the United States as a proponent of non-proliferation. Recent controversial U.S. nuclear policies Reliable Replacement Warhead Program. This program seeks to replace existing warheads with a smaller number of warhead types designed to be easier to maintain without testing. Critics charge that this would lead to a new generation of nuclear weapons and would increase pressures to test. Congress has not funded this program. Complex Transformation, formerly known as Complex 2030, is an effort to shrink the U.S. nuclear weapons complex and restore the ability to produce the fissile cores of the primaries of U.S. thermonuclear weapons. Critics see it as an upgrade to the entire nuclear weapons complex to support the production and maintenance of the new generation of nuclear weapons. Congress has not funded this program. Nuclear Bunker Buster, formerly known as the Robust Nuclear Earth Penetrator, this program aimed to modify an existing gravity bomb to penetrate into soil and rock in order to destroy underground targets. Critics argue that this would lower the threshold for use of nuclear weapons. Congress did not fund this proposal, which was later withdrawn. Missile defense, formerly known as National Missile Defense. This program seeks to build a network of interceptor missiles to protect the United States and its allies from incoming missiles, including nuclear-armed missiles. Critics have argued that this would impede nuclear disarmament and possibly stimulate a nuclear arms race. Elements of missile defense are being deployed in Poland and the Czech Republic, despite Russian opposition. Former U.S. officials Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn proposed in January 2007 that the United States rededicate itself to the goal of eliminating nuclear weapons, concluding, "We endorse setting the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons and working energetically on the actions required to achieve that goal." Arguing a year later that with nuclear weapons more widely available, deterrence is decreasingly effective and increasingly hazardous, the authors concluded that although it is tempting and easy to say we can't get there from here, we must chart a course toward that goal. During his presidential campaign, U.S. President-elect Barack Obama pledged to set a goal of a world without nuclear weapons, and pursue it. U.S. policy options for nuclear terrorism equals, the United States has taken the lead in ensuring that nuclear materials globally are properly safeguarded. A popular program that has received bipartisan domestic support for over a decade is the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. While this program has been deemed a success, many believe that its funding levels need to be increased so as to ensure that all dangerous nuclear materials are secured in the most expeditious manner possible. The Center program has led to several other innovative and important non-proliferation programs that need to continue to be a budget priority in order to ensure that nuclear weapons do not spread to actors hostile to the United States. Key programs: Cooperative Threat Reduction. The Center program provides funding to help Russia secure materials that might be used in nuclear or chemical weapons as well as to dismantle weapons of mass destruction and their associated infrastructure in Russia. Global Threat Reduction Initiative. Expanding on the success of the CTR, the GTRI will expand nuclear weapons and material securing and dismantlement activities to states outside of the former Soviet Union. Other states. While the vast majority of states have adhered to the stipulations of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a few states have either refused to sign the treaty or have pursued nuclear weapons programs while not being members of the treaty. Many view the pursuit of nuclear weapons by these states as a threat to non-proliferation and world peace, and therefore seek policies to discourage the spread of nuclear weapons to these states, a few of which are often described by the U.S. as rogue states. Declared nuclear weapon states not party to the NPT. Indian nuclear weapons, 80-100 active warheads, Pakistani nuclear weapons, 90-110 active warheads, North Korea nuclear weapons,